I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning. So these meetings they'll be an hour for the synchronous stuff, and then an optional extra half hour for people who want to talk more discussion stuff, but I know an hour fits better into a lot of people's schedules. So we will be keeping things on a firm content delivery. Will all be done within the next half hour. And then for people who want to stick around, do some more discussion, dig into stuff a little bit more, that will be kind of an optional extra bit. So the other big goal that we had today, and in not ideal modeling here, I did not actually put out what our learning objectives for today were, but our learning objectives, getting to know people, getting oriented to what's going on, and then just making sure we're all familiar with some terminology, especially as everybody is suddenly learning about all new terms and online stuff and things that we might not necessarily be familiar with. So that is our phase 2, and I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so online pedagogy, just a crash course here. Most of what makes for good online pedagogy is the same stuff that makes for good face-to-face pedagogy, right? A lot of this hasn't changed. Things might look a little bit different. Also thinking about kind of online pedagogy due to circumstances like we're in now, pandemic. Things like compassion and good communication, thinking about equity and accessibility, scaffolded learning, backward course design. Some of these are things we'll talk about more next week, but these are things that hopefully we have been incorporating into our in-person classes, and they are just as important when thinking about online classes. Some things were always important, I would argue, but are potentially more important in an online environment, particularly when we're thinking about combining synchronous and asynchronous flexible assignments. And that's something we're going to spend some real time on next week. But I want to focus on some things that might be different. And so that will be some of the stuff that we're talking about today. Terminology. Some of these are things people submitted. Some of these are things that I just thought we should make sure we all know what they mean. So LMS, or Learning Management System, and then module being sort of the unit that we talk about a lot of times with, particularly with online classes. So I will say for my, one of my classes this last spring, I shifted into module-based units. So instead of there being kind of, we're spending a week on this, a week on that, instead of it being organized by time as much, shifted much more towards kind of units that were modules, and students could complete them at a time that worked for them. So thinking about, this is what a lot of us would think of as like a unit in a class, but people tend to use the term module more when they're talking about online things. Learning management systems, just throwing out these are some of the major ones. Most of us don't have a choice about which major platform we use. That's done at our school's level. Canvas, this is roughly in order of number of people using them. So Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, Desire to Learn, and Sakai, which is the open source version of Canvas. And we used it at Notre Dame, not a huge fan, but that's neither here nor there. So then those are sort of the ones that we tend to use through institutions. Google Sites, WordPress, a lot of people set up their own course websites, and that's something that can give you a little bit more flexibility on some fronts. If you want your class to have a big public-facing component, your students are interacting with a broader audience, that can be a great way, because most of these LMS platforms have passwords and things. They're protected. And then the ones I wanted to talk about here are some additional, most of these can integrate nicely. So Gradecraft, Hypothesis, Perusal, and Schoolology. Perusal I just added thanks to, I think Suzanne had mentioned this in the chat. But these are things that can be integrated into most major LMSs, and can give you a little bit more. Some of these are things that are specifically geared towards kind of flexible assignments, gamifying things, collaborative online work. So the ones, and I will be making this available. These are links. You could go check out the websites if you are interested in doing so. I am a big fan of, so this was Gradecraft is this first one. I used it for a course last year, And this is very much designed in you level up, right? You're getting points and you're working up towards whatever cutoff you want. And so there are a bunch of different elements. Do you want to focus more on your quizzes? Do you want to focus more? And so sort of set up in a way where you earn the points that you want to earn to get the grade that you want to get. I think this worked really great. I used this for a class that was Greek and Latin roots of medical terminology. It was great because students had very different things they wanted to get out of the class. So they could focus on the elements that they wanted. Do they want to write papers? Do they want to take tests? Do they want to do quizzes? Do they want to memorize lots of vocabulary? But I think this is something that I'm going to be using a lot in the fall, specifically because I think it really works well for an online kind of an asynchronous format where people can pick what they want to do when they want to do them, and they have a lot of different routes to success in a class. And there are lots of other, this is something that's done through University of Michigan, which is where I did my PhD. So this was the platform I was familiar with, but there are a lot of other platforms that are specifically geared towards this kind of gamifying where you are earning points up. Also, just as a quick side point, this is not a paid advertisement for Gradecraft, but I think it orients students towards thinking about earning points towards what they want to do. It's kind of as opposed to everyone starts with 100% in a class and then you lose points. Every time you do an assignment, you have the chance to lose points to get away from that 100%. This I think is a much better framework to thinking about learning and grades and things like that. I would recommend hypothesis and perusal are both collaborative notation things. You can have a whole class work on a website, you can upload a PDF, and everybody can comment on things together. I think these are really great ways to have a text-based discussion where people are close reading things together, even if they aren't doing it all at the same time. So I think these are great tools for replacing some of that in-person close reading of a text that we're not going to be able to do in an asynchronous format. And Schoolology is another, it's similar to Gradecraft. So I would encourage people to play around with these. Just a couple other words that we might be seeing and want to know what they mean. Flipped class, this is basically students are doing the content, learning about new concepts, watching videos, doing readings outside of class, so that the inside of class time is not content delivery, it's the discussion parts. I think a lot of us do this in varying degrees in classes, but that is primarily what we are talking about. Maybe you watch a video outside of class and then inside of class you can get all of that discussion going on together. Metacognition, if you want to know more about metacognition, Ellen Lee spends a lot of time thinking about metacognition and has some wonderful activities around it. But this is getting students to think about the process of learning. And I would say from a survival perspective as teachers, but also from students really understanding why we're making the choices we're making. I think that getting students to reflect on their own learning process and making the reasons, the rationales behind our choices more transparent, I think is good for us and good for our students. It's not that we're doing this, I do a lot of low stakes quizzing in my classes. It's not because I hate my students and I want them to have to take a bunch of quizzes all the time, right? I let them know up front why we're doing this, because this is better. Here's the reasons that we know that this helps you learn, memorize, retain information. And getting students to have that reflection process. How did you study? What was useful about this unit? And as a lot of us are moving into previously untread territory in terms of our teaching, I think this is going to be a really good place to get students to think about what's working for them and what they would like to see more or less of. And so kind of having constant channels of feedback open. Universal design for learning is something we'll talk about more next week, but and this gets called UDL a lot. This is basically designing our courses to be accessible to every learner. One of the great things about this is that if you design your courses with a UDL framework in mind, you don't have to change things if a student has certain disabilities, maybe hearing loss, or has medical conditions that require them to take this class sometimes, or this is great because it also doesn't mean that students have to tell you about things that they may be struggling with, right? A student doesn't have to tell me that they might be missing class sometimes because of mental health issues they have, if my class is built in a way that gives them a certain amount of flexibility around attendance and participation. which is nice for, some things I think we probably need to have students actually disclose to us, but universal design for learning makes it that our classes by default are going to be accessible to everyone. So we'll talk more about what that means in practice, but that is what UDL means. Synchronous and asynchronous, we've probably heard these until we are sick of them this last semester. At a basic level, this just has to do with synchronous, the learning occurs at the same time, not necessarily in the same place, right? So if we've been having Zoom classes, this meeting right now is synchronous. Asynchronous is not that. So when people are learning at different times and checking in different ways. Semi-synchronous, blended synchronous, these are some terms that people use, hybrid, all of these have to do with a combination of the two. So maybe there's going to be some synchronous elements, but also there's going to be some message board components. There's going to be some blogging and commenting on blogging, whatever. The pros of asynchronous, I think a lot of us probably are a little bit resistant to going asynchronous because it's so different from how most of us have learned and taught for most of our lives. The pros of asynchronous are accessibility and flexibility, right? If we have students in different time zones, if we have students with different ability to access the internet. I had some students that they didn't have good Wi-Fi at home, so they're using their phones and their data. They could only do certain things when they had data left on their phones. So the cons of this are going to be that I think a lot of us felt that real absence of the kind of classroom experience, that robust discussion. And I can pop into a discussion breakout room on Zoom. It's not the same as walking around a classroom and having that crosstalk and having kind of ideas kind of cross-pollinating. So we will wrestle with how to deal with some of these things. I don't know the answer to it, but that is kind of the main questions we want to think about with synchronous and asynchronous. That should have been on later, so we'll come back to that slide. High structure. So this was something someone had requested that we talk about. I had not really heard the term high structure before, did a little bit of research, and these are available on the course website, or the course week 1 information. But high structure, as far as I can tell, seems to more or less be synonymous with just structure, in that flexibility, and I would really recommend, Ellen shared this in the Discord, but I would recommend that people check this one out. It talks about flexibility and structure as not being at odds with one another. And so having structure, making your expectations clear, having a regular, not expecting your students to read your mind about what you want when you want it, when we're doing certain things, really making that schedule and those expectations very transparent and on the surface. And there is some, in particular, so this is a little bit of a side tangent of mine, but a lot of pedagogy research is kind of one-off things, not big enough sample sizes to necessarily say definitively. This is a confirmation of an earlier study, which I like to see as research goes to. Also University of Washington, which is in my state now. But increasing course structure has real benefits for first gen and students who have a marginalized identity in a variety of different ways. People who are not good at studenting, so to speak. If you don't have parents who went to a similar type of institution, you may not know all of these kind of implicit expectations that we have about how to be a student. And making that structure clear and transparent and upfront can really help students. And so as Heather Garcia mentioned, right, structure is an inclusive practice, as is flexibility. So thank you to whoever suggested high structure. That was not a term that I was familiar with before. Resilient pedagogy. Ellen, can I pass this off to you?
Sure. So this is something I'm getting interested in. Amy, Suzanne asked a question in the chat about the build-up model that you can respond to while I'm talking.
Yes, excellent.
And she also commented that high structure can also be about little low stakes assignments, which is what you kind of already showed us that you're doing, right? So in terms of resilient pedagogy, this is something I've gotten really interested in the past few weeks, kind of thinking about how overwhelmed I was in spring when things suddenly shifted to online. and I had to rethink my entire course, right? So resilient design is, and for those of you who are in the Discord, you may have already read the post I wrote about this. So if we want to keep talking about it, we can do it asynchronously there. But it's a term borrowed from architecture, like a lot of our pedagogical terms, like scaffolding and stuff like that, to describe building design that's flexible and responsive to changes and interruptions in the environment. So like putting in hurricane windows or building a house on stilts, if you know there's going to be flooding at some point, right? It still works in a regular situation, but it's even more effective in kind of emergency situations, right? For pedagogical purposes, this kind of talks about it's thinking about a way how to construct our courses so that we can change modalities, that is from online to in-person, without having to resort to emergency stopgap measures. So for me, when I switched to online, one of the biggest things I had to think about changing was those in-person assessments. So like quizzes and exams, which made up a big part of the grade for my students. And so one of the things that I'm going to be doing for fall is just not including, every exam is going to be take home. How we do this with kind of vocab quizzes and those little quizzes that Amy mentioned, how exactly we do that with the little low stakes things, I'm not sure. But that kind of resiliency, I see it mostly as a response to kind of the high flex model, that it's requiring us to think about teaching both an in-person class and an online class at the same time. If we're thinking about our classes, one thing that can operate at the same time in both modalities, which is the next term. I guess I could just go ahead and do that too. Modality. The mode in which we teach our class, right? Are we in person? Are we online? Are we doing hybrid? Or that high flex model, which Amy's going to talk about more in a second. So basically, the way I see this is kind of weatherproofing, or in this case, pandemic proofing, I guess, our classes, if, and I would say inevitably when, we need to make the move from in-person, for those of us who are going to be in person, to online. Okay, and now I'm going to stop talking. Back to you, Amy.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. And microlearning is a term that, as I was prepping for this, really just talks about these kind of bite-sized units of class stuff. So, and in part, this can be, so for example, I know Ellen is planning to, for her Latin classes, have little tiny bite-sized videos that cover content, as opposed to, so people can have a bite-size, like, let's learn about this word, or let's learn about this concept, in little snippets. As opposed to having kind of big units of stuff. And I think probably that is the easiest way for a lot of us to do content delivery at this point, is going to be having little bite-sized videos or bite-sized readings, or things that we can, that will give us a lot more flexibility. Student-centered or learner-centered is really talking about kind of put students' individual needs and interests at the center of learning. Give students a little bit more autonomy. So asking students what they need, what they want, what works for them, and really kind of an orientation to thinking about students as the center, not what do I want to teach, but what will help my students learn. And so that oftentimes involves getting students involved in planning, implementation, and assessment parts of the learning experience. For the first time ever, I tried having my students be part of the syllabus design process for one of my classes this last semester. And you know, it was a mixed result in terms of but I think it was something that I really enjoyed the conversations we had, even though we could have done it a little bit better, I think. And so the big thing I think a lot of us want to know, we've been hearing a lot about high flex, or sometimes blend flex, or if you teach at Pitt, Pit flex. This is the big trendy term.
It sounds very gross. I don't know how I feel about pit flex.
Pit flex sounds gross. So, but this is some version of when we think about kind of a blended, this hybrid model, right? So high flex stands for hybrid flexible. This is a term that is taken from, it's actually been around for a really long time. 2003 is when it was kind of first developed by faculty at San Francisco State. And it was specifically done to be able to serve students who, a lot of them were adult learners who had jobs during the day. Commuters, like not our traditional, a lot of us teach, either if we teach K-12, it's a pretty uniform class size or like age and demographic there. For college, a lot of us are thinking 18 to 22. And so this was designed to better serve a non-traditional student body. And it's part of what is important about this is that you're trying to develop an educationally comparable in-person and online format, or synchronous and asynchronous format. This is not teach a class in person and record yourself and then put the video online so that people could watch it later, right? That is not going to be a comparable experience for the students who are there having an interactive learning experience, and then some other people can watch a recording of it. And part of what HyFlex involves is allowing students to transition between the two options. This is not splitting your class up into two groups, who's going to be online, who's going to be in person. When done well, students can flow back and forth between those. So some days, maybe something comes up or they're not feeling well. That will probably inevitably happen, right? A student is sick and can't come to the in-person, even though they have generally been going to the in-person, and that they can slide seamlessly into an asynchronous or an online version and then slide back if they want to be in person again. This is not an easy thing to do. And I think what it's going to look like for all of us, if this is our goal, and I think we're probably going to need, whether or not we want to call it like HyFlex TM, we're going to be needing to do something that allows our students, as there are health needs, as there are life needs, right? A lot of our students are facing a lot of uncertainty in their family and their living situations. People have lost jobs. I think we're going to need something that allows this flexibility or I mean, eventually we will possibly just go fully online at a lot of our schools. But as long as, if we are being asked to teach in person, we need to have something that allows students who cannot come to in-person classes for a variety of reasons to be able to participate fully in the class and not get a kind of second-rate knockoff version of our class. So, there we go. So Dr. Beatty at San Francisco State is the person who kind of first coined this idea, coined this term. I would recommend, this is a very short document that this is linked to if you want to go check it out. He talks about the 4 pillars of universal principles of HyFlex course design. And so we have learner choice, providing meaningful alternative participation modes and letting students think about, they can choose between those different modes, right? There's not a like, here's our first choice, here's our second choice, here's our third choice, but an idea of making actual, all of these options are viable, which gets into this equivalency, right? We want what our learning outcomes are, all of the different ways of participating, all of the different activities should all be aligned towards those learning outcomes. And so students can take any road they want to get to those outcomes. This segues really nicely into backward course design, which we'll talk about next week. But the idea of we start with those learning outcomes and then think about what paths could get us there. And I think this is going to really involve a lot of brainstorming and thinking differently about what kinds of activities could get me to my learning outcomes for my classes. Reusability. So having the same types of things are going to show up in your different engagement models. This is new for me, I will say, but thinking about if a student's engagement involves producing a podcast, right? Using that in a different mode of engagement, a different modality. The other students can consume said podcast and engage in a different way so that these same pieces are showing up in the different engagements. We're not having totally distinct class experiences. We're having overlap and kind of, I keep using this cross-pollination. For folks who don't know me personally, I do like bees, and that might be why this is my metaphor that I keep using here. And then accessibility, right? So this is going to involve both, so equipping students with technology skills and equitable access to all participation modes. This is something that is going to, right, if something requires a very fancy computer to participate in a certain way, not everyone is going to be able to do that. If something requires being able to be at a certain place and time, access the internet, right? Not everyone's going to be able to do that. And so if you have the best version of the class requires certain technological access that your students might not all have, that's going to be a problem because again, we're kind of creating a first class and second class of student participation in the class. These are really great principles and values. I will say in terms of what that looks like in my classes, I don't know what that is yet. And that is hopefully something we will have a chance to talk about with each other. So we have 5 minutes left before our official hour block. And so I'm gonna put people into rooms at, well, for me, 11:30. Please feel free to leave. I will reshuffle rooms, and if people want to stick around for another half hour and talk through some of this stuff in more detail, please do. Just as a quick wrap up, and these can be questions since actually quick wrap up might take our last 4 minutes. Think about these going forward. These are things that will be useful. One of the things that we started our classes in person. My students knew each other from in-person interactions. And then when we transitioned online, they were building on those interactions. If our classes start asynchronous, hybrid, online, they're never going to have that community building moment. And this is something I'm really concerned about. Because our discussion, having that trust, having that relationship is something that we maybe aren't going to be able to develop in the same way that we have. And so this is something I'm really thinking about. What kind of beginning of class stuff is what have you done in the past? What does or doesn't work about them? How do you start to form a community out of students who maybe don't know each other? And then the follow-up to that, what could these tone setting community building activities look like in a class that's online from the start?